interpersonal communication, both oral and written communication. Am I forgetting something else in terms of soft skills? Problem solving. I consider that maybe more of a hard skill, but I think that's something that everyone in the sciences can feel like is an important aspect. By the way, how many of you are related to science education? I think that most of you in the room are science educators. Okay. So again, my background is in physics. I won't focus on physics alone today, so I'll be trying to think in terms of science education in general. But a lot of the ideas that I use in physics should be transferable to other science disciplines and other fields that are non-science as well. But problem solving is certainly important for the sciences, and in general, critical thinking skills I think are maybe one of the most important overall goals for any student. Maybe the main reason for going to college or university is to improve critical thinking skills. So how many of you feel like you are already doing some kind of assessment in soft skills, especially like written and oral communication? Okay. How many of you would like to do more? Or feel like this is an area that is a challenge that you'd like to do more? Good. For us, this is an ongoing challenge at the university where I'm at. So the University of North Carolina where I teach is a liberal arts school. So slightly different than this university here that is more of a technical school. The school that I graduated from, that I got my PhD from, North Carolina State University, is more like this one, focused more on science and engineering. But students are still required to take classes in writing and oral speaking and even a foreign language. So there's some broad-based education. But the UNC Chapel Hill is even more of a broad-based liberal arts education. And so these soft skills are assessed somewhat in the classroom, but then there are lots of opportunities for students to get experience in leadership and working in groups and teams outside of the classroom. And I suspect that happens to a certain extent here as well, but maybe students are not assessed on that. Do any of you have any experience in finding ways of giving students credit or assessing students' ability to, say, perform in a leadership capacity in like an extracurricular activity? Yes?
A little bit, but for the assessment, I'm not so sure whether that's really called assessment, but you ask the student to rate their skill, and then you keep some sort of description and example. For example, when leadership, we just give 1 to 5 scale, but for one we have some description with that one, what it means, and then 5 what it means, and then ask the student whether where he is in the range of 1 to 5. But actually we read it from the student on their own, but not anything special. I mean, that's what I did.
Okay, so it's more of a student self-report. The students are assessing themselves. Okay, does that go on a transcript, or does that get reported somehow?
Not on the transcript, but just only the when we conduct some sort of activities, and at the end, after 3 weeks, a month, or 3 months, let's say the student evaluate themselves, and then we have only the report to the faculty. Mainly, the student will not get the idea whether they improve it or not, but we just feedback them somehow, but not the score.
Okay. Okay. Maybe I should write down some notes. We've shared quite a few different concepts already. here, can you see it, or should I type on the screen? Better. Maybe the screen? Okay, so just as a little bit of a summary here, talk about the think, pair, share, coming up with an individual idea, talking with each other, and then sharing that idea either verbally or in writing. Could be an electronic submission. Formative versus summative assessment. Again, formative is in the moment, and summative would be more like an exam. So think, pair, share would be an example of a formative assessment. One suggestion that is becoming popular in the United States with some schools, a way of assessing some of these soft skills and giving students credit for the activities that they do outside of class is an e-portfolio. How many of you are familiar with an electronic portfolio? No? Okay. So let me talk a little bit about that. Is this big enough? Can you see on the screen in the back? So two different ideas that are similar as a way to summarize students' work at the university. Most traditional is a transcript, so a summary of students' courses and the grades that they did in those courses. And I think that that's practiced pretty much around the world. So if I say transcript, you know what that means in terms of the summary of grades and the courses taken. But students obviously learn more than just from the courses. They also are doing activities outside of those courses, and there may be some new activities that are maybe not like group activities, could be individual as well. So for example, makerspace activities. Are you familiar with makerspace? I assume that Kimwood has a makerspace of some sort. Does anybody know? No? Okay. So a makerspace is a place where students can go and create something. It's a mini engineering laboratory. And these are becoming popular in the United States and maybe in other places. I know I've visited some other countries where these makerspaces are becoming popular. And they often have a variety of tools and devices. So one of the more common and popular ones now is a 3D printer. Everybody knows what a 3D printer is. That is usually making something out of plastic. So if you wanted to make, say, a model looks like this microphone out of plastic, or maybe a new artificial elbow or knee or something. You want to model something, you can do that with plastic. And so you have an idea and you want to create something. So you could use a 3D printer for that. These makerspaces often have a laser cutter, so for cutting either wood or plastic. Maybe something for making signs, so like a vinyl cutter for making banners or signs. Maybe a sewing machine for making costumes or something. Then usually some woodworking tools, so like the kinds that you would find in a wood shop, so like a saw and lathe and tools like that for making things out of wood. Some kinds of metal fabrication, but not as common. Usually soldering stations for making electronics devices. And so these maker spaces are kind of an all-in-one place for students to take an idea and make it into reality. So that's becoming popular, especially at schools that focus on the sciences and technology. But we often don't incorporate those into classes. Our makerspace at UNC, there are some classes that use the makerspace, but a lot of times students are just going there on their own. And so the question is, how do they get credit for that? One way of doing it is with a co-curricular transcript. So this is a way to summarize the activities that are done outside of the classroom. So this could also include some details about leadership opportunities or extracurricular activities that students have participated in outside of their classes. And then the electronic portfolio is a mechanism, another mechanism for summarizing details of the student's work both in class and outside of class, so that an employer might be able to look at not just the transcript, but the electronic portfolio or the co-curricular transcript to see what other skills, the hard skills and soft skills the student has achieved over their time in the university. So again, now that I've described this a bit, how many of you are familiar with the electronic portfolio? Is that something that is used here at all? No? Okay, so
I think we have some sort of like, we call that an activity book, but maybe it's not on the electronic.
Okay.
A portfolio for the student. When they do some activity, then they put it in the book. And then they enjoy it by some unit in the university. But I don't know whether it's electronic already or not.
is that something that they would then share with an employer? Like when they graduate, if they wanted to...
I think maybe we have to ask students. This part I'm not so sure, but they always sometimes come and ask for hours of activities. When they're doing this, they're recording it.
Okay.
But I'm not so sure that that will end up piece of paper and then the employer can see or not.
Okay. Let me try switching microphones. It seems like this one. Is this one better? You can hear me better? Okay. Sorry, I should have done that earlier. Feel free to stop me if you don't understand or if we need to change something like that. And just to clarify, is there a makerspace here? No. Okay.
I think sort of. I think there's a place in Fibo that the student can, in the field robotics, if you look behind us, the student can go there and build something. Okay. But maybe it's not really full equipped with a lot of things, but there's some sort of engineering try to build one, like what you say, but so far they haven't yet.
Okay. Yeah, this is the kind of thing that maybe starts in an engineering department, but the makerspaces that I'm talking about are open to all students, but with training. So obviously there could be some dangers of using some of the devices, especially using like a lathe or a saw. And so students have to get trained in how to use a laser cutter before they can actually use that. Our makerspace at UNC is, I guess, about the size of these two rooms together, and it is now already too small. It's only 2 years old, but we're looking to expand to a bigger space because it is so popular. So maybe one idea is to think about getting a makerspace. It can be expensive though, so it definitely requires some capital outlay to create such a place. But that seems like it has been very popular at our school, and ours is not even a technical school. Okay. Let me see if you have any questions about the information so far.
Yeah. So I just want to just get a little bit more detail about the soft skill. Just that you mentioned just only the leadership. So I think that the soft skill is so many of that. So what the other does you in your assessment for the soft skill of the student?
Now let's maybe define the soft skills. So at least in my mind, when I'm thinking about soft skills, thinking about how well people work together, either in groups typically, or teams, so group work or teamwork, communication, both oral communication and written communication, leadership. What other aspects do you think about for soft skills that we should identify?
Thinking skill,
moral and ethic, okay. Good, I had not thought about that, but it was good.
Should be thinking skill, like analytical thinking or critical thinking.
Okay, yeah. Again, at least in my mind, some of those analytical and thinking skills do get assessed in the classroom with like examinations, whereas like leadership is typically not assessed on examinations. So I think that the challenge is coming up with ways to assess some of these soft skills outside of traditional methods of assessment, namely examinations. I suspect that we would mostly agree that our big tool for assessment is like end of course examinations, final examinations. I think you have more of a, I forget what it's called, there's a standard examination test that students take that's more comprehensive than just at the course level. Is there maybe it's an entrance examination for college, or is there another comprehensive examination? No? Okay. So maybe course examinations are the main tool that we typically use. At least that's true for our university. So what are some ways that, that you know of for assessing some of these soft skills that, that don't get captured with examinations, written examinations? I'm guessing too that most of course examinations are written, or do you have oral examinations? Yeah, for us, usually the written examinations. Especially in large classes, it's difficult to do oral examinations, but we sometimes have some opportunities for assessing students on their oral communication. They give presentations in class, or maybe a poster presentation at a conference, but sometimes these are not graded, and so this is an area that we struggle to assess properly because of the time and resources. So what are some strategies that you know of for assessing these soft skills beyond what I captured here with the electronic portfolio or co-curricular?
So maybe one method to access the written report that I can think of is that an instructor read through the students' report and then give the feedback on things that maybe a student have done well, maybe things that they can get improved.
Giving students feedback on their writing is certainly important. One aspect that, that we have focused on in our curriculum is an opportunity for revision. I assume that you're familiar with the peer review process. So the students submit something in writing, and then that is reviewed by their peers. They get feedback, and then an opportunity to revise their writing and make improvements, and so that they have this writing cycle. How often is that done in classes that you're familiar with? Some, a little, not so much? Yeah, I have to agree that this doesn't happen very often in our classes either. We try to do this more often, but I would say in the 4 years of university that at my institution, students get an opportunity to do this maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3 times throughout that period. So it really should probably be more. But this peer review process can be very helpful in students making improvements to their writing rather than just submitting writing and getting a grade and not having a chance to make corrections. So let me add that to our list. And of course, this peer review process mimics the evaluation that scientists do. So if we write a scientific paper, we submit it, it goes to an editor, that editor sends it out to usually 2 to 3 reviewers who are peers, familiar with the subject, but maybe not experts in that particular area. They give feedback. Usually anonymously, but sometimes you know who the reviewers are. And then there's an opportunity for making revisions before the paper is finally submitted to a peer-reviewed journal. So that's a scientific process that we feel as scientists is important. And so giving students the opportunity to be part of that process gives them kind of a window into the scientific review process, but it is also beneficial for them individually as they can make improvements to their writing. And there's a side benefit that the students who are doing the reviewing get to see examples of other students' writing. And they can see this student did a better job of explaining than I did in my report that I submitted, or yeah, I can see that that writing is not very clear, and I need to be more clear in my own writing. So it gives students feedback in a different way for both the writing opportunity, but then also the reviewing side. So that experience on both sides can be beneficial. What we find is a challenge then is holding students accountable for being good reviewers. So then there's an extra training process in getting the students to be good reviewers and taking the job seriously as part of that review process. So then they're getting graded not just on their own work that they submitted, but then also on the quality of their review. So this can be somewhat time consuming to do this peer review process. So we usually only do this maybe once, possibly twice in a one semester course. But we do have several courses where we incorporate this process into our curriculum. So just a quick show of hands. How many of you teach courses or are involved with courses that do this kind of peer review process, where students get an opportunity to revise their work and do the review as well? A little bit? Okay. Once in a while, okay. Okay, so maybe that's something new that you might be able to incorporate that again gets at least the written communication aspect. What are some other opportunities that you know of for assessing soft skills? Especially maybe like leadership and teamwork. This is something that I struggle with on knowing how to do this. So one aspect that we have incorporated into our classes, all of our introductory physics classes are now taught in what we call a lecture studio format. I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint presentation that gives a bit of a summary here. So a lot of the work that we've done to change our classes at UNC is based on some work that was pioneered by my advisor, Bob Biegner, at North Carolina State University a number of years ago. So this is about 20 years ago now. So Scale Up stands for Student-Centered Active Learning Environment for Undergraduate Programs. It started off as a small program and then grew to a larger size, so that's what the name Scale Up implies. So this is a learning environment where students are actively involved in the learning process, and the focus is more on doing than on just receiving information, so again, active learning. And the students are working in groups and environments where there are, well, it's a little bit more like this, where students can sit together and work in teams, but typically in round tables. I think I have a picture of a room here. Yeah. So we renovated some of our classrooms to go from a traditional laboratory setting to one that has round tables, where students can face each other and can work together on an activity and can also communicate with each other. So this kind of environment allows for students to talk with their neighbor. But if you wanted to have a group discussion with 6 or 7 students, it would be difficult to do in this room without moving the tables around. Fortunately, a room like this has the ability to move tables around so students could work in bigger groups. But these round tables facilitate that discussion and work more readily. So the idea is based a little bit like a banquet room. So if you go to a large conference and there's a banquet meal, the wait staff needs to be able to get to everyone in the room, just like the teachers need to be able to get to everyone in the room. A room like this facilitates that fairly well, but if I needed to get to the middle of the room, it's a little bit difficult. The round tables facilitates that movement of the instructors. In a room like this, we would typically have 2 or 3 instructors, usually one lead teaching assistant, and then maybe a couple of undergraduate learning assistants that can move around in the room. So students are working together in teams of typically 3 students at where each of these round tables has seats for 9 students. So it's usually 3 groups of 3 students each. And then the students do some individual work, but they also do some teamwork. So they're getting a grade as a group and then also individually. And so that teamwork is assessed partly on their performance as a team and how well they perform. And we can incorporate some additional assessment and motivation by giving the students extra credit if their team scores above a certain threshold on their examinations. So for each of the midterm exams, we usually have 3 midterm exams. If that team scores above, say, 85% as an average for their team, then maybe 5 bonus points gets added to each of the individual students' scores. So that's an incentive for everyone in the group to work together and to perform as well as possible. So that would be one example of how to assess and reward good, effective teamwork. Are there examples that you can think of for assessing kind of leadership and teamwork? Maybe any experiences that you were familiar with?
Maybe like sometimes we have group activities, and then at the end we have some sort of peer evaluation. We ask the student in the group to rate the other student in the group, but we give some conditions. For example, like we can give only 3 grades. For example, A, B plus, and B. So students have 5, they can get 2A, 2B plus, and then 1B or something. And then at the end, we get the idea what is the dynamic of the group. So that somehow we use that sometimes, but not so often.
Yeah, I've used something similar to that too. I like what you suggested about kind of allocating a certain number of points so that the temptation I see with that peer rating is that students always want or tend to give each other high scores. So if you don't have some special conditions like you mentioned, the students will just say, everyone participated equally, we all did our part, everyone should get full credit. Occasionally, the truth will come out about somebody who was not showing up to class or not pulling their weight and should not get full credit. The students even then are like, maybe the student should get maybe a 10% deduction, when I would give them maybe a 50% deduction because it really looks like they didn't participate very well. So say a little bit more about how the conditions that you mentioned about kind of spreading those points around or the grades.
So the condition is just only like, let's say we have 3 grades that the student need to give to the others without giving themselves, him or herself. So the condition, let's say we have a group of 5, sometimes we ask the student to give 2 A's. and then 2B plus, and then 1B to let's say you have 6, and then they grade the other 5. So at the end, we can see the dynamic. So like let's say we don't really want them to give everyone the same or everyone very low, and we want to classify, but we don't see how like I don't want to give the conditions such that they give someone a lot of score and then someone is very low. So sometimes when we give a group score, let's say we have 50 points, and we have to give it to the 5. Sometimes the student, if we don't have any condition, they may give one student 30 and the other the rest. Or some will get 0. We don't want to see that. We just only want to see how the student rank the people in that group. And then when combine all the other 5, but for those who get the lowest score, let's say B is the lowest, and then they get too many B. So we might have to think what actually happened there.
Right, good, okay. And another variation on that I've seen work well is like if there are 3 students working in our groups here, we tell the students to rank the order of how well they participate. So they can't all have the same rank, can't all be number 1, but you can rank Joe worked the hardest and deserves the highest score, so gets number 1, and Sarah is the 2nd, and Sam gets the 3rd, or something like that. So the students are forced to make a decision about 1st, 2nd, 3rd, rather than all getting the same. But then sometimes what can be beneficial is the explanation that goes with it. So we usually ask students when they do this kind of peer feedback to give some explanation about justification for their ranking or their grade, to explain how each student participated. And then usually get some feedback from each of them in the group, you get a pretty good sense of how they participated. And then of course as the instructor you can have final say about and normalizing and being fair and equitable. Because sometimes the students are too generous and sometimes they're overly harsh too, and so you have to kind of moderate that. Good. Yeah, that's a good example. You have one?
Should students also rank themselves, or should they only rank the other students in the same group?
Yeah, good question. So the question is whether students in that process should evaluate themselves or just the other students. When I've done this process, I have required students to evaluate themselves as well as the others, so that they do some self-reflection rather than just evaluating the other students. And then, of course, as the instructor, I can have final say about whether I use that information or not. But I think that that is helpful for them to think about how they contribute relative to their peers. Sometimes students are honest about that, and sometimes not as much. So that, yeah, maybe not everyone agrees with that process, but I think that that's worthwhile. How many of you have either tried that kind of peer evaluation process or are familiar with it? Maybe you've done that as a student yourself or in some context? A little bit of experience maybe? Not so much. Okay. So maybe something else new to try.
I'm from Faculty of Industrial Education and Technology. So our faculty teach the students to become teachers. One of my course really support the student working as individually and as a team. That course is inquiry-based learning. So the whole set, the student working like making a research report. So they can work as a team to create a project. Then they set hypotheses to work as individually. And to prove if they accept or reject the hypothesis. and then they come, sometimes as a group to brainstorm the ideas and then they separate. But it takes a lot of time of as a lecturer of the students. Can you give any suggestions so I have time to work something else instead of they meet me out of the class, in the class, working real hard.
Right. Yeah, I should mention that most of the instruction that we do in our introductory physics classes, especially this type, is also this kind of inquiry-based learning. And it does take more time to cover a certain idea. And a lot of instructors struggle with this, that, wait, how are we going to cover all of the curriculum that we need, all the different topics, if students are spending more time with this inquiry-based method of instruction? The conclusion that I've learned from the education research is that sometimes it is better to do more with less. That sometimes spending more time on a fewer number of topics can be more beneficial than covering many topics just a little bit. And so there's a trade-off. We have had to drop some topics from our curriculum so that students can spend more time in the classroom delving into these interactive engagement strategies and teamwork and talking about ideas in class rather than just covering a lot of different topics quickly. But it is a trade-off. It is a challenge.
But it seems to me that deep learning, because they're going to become the teachers in the community, so they have to see what the problems, and then at the end they have give suggestions for the community, so right. they have the ideas, but then they should know that only their own discipline. They don't know anything else beside that. Not so good. So it seems to me that it works very, very well to me.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm not sure for the student.
Yes, I agree. Does anyone have any other thoughts to share? How are you doing right now? Would you like to stand up and take a break? Should we take maybe just a few minute break? Get up, stretch. Maybe you have some other thoughts and questions. And then have an activity for you for actually practicing writing some learning outcomes and then doing planning step for that. So assessing learning outcomes, so we talked about what learning outcomes look like and maybe get a little bit of practice in that. So how many of you are familiar with the SMART goals? This is an acronym, at least in English, that could be used sometimes for thinking of goals or objectives that are SMART. So this is an acronym, S-M-A-R-T. If you want to have goals or outcomes that are effective, they need to be SMART goals. And when we're making learning outcomes, most importantly, they need to be measurable. And quite often, I will see objectives or something that an instructor may call an objective that says something like, students will gain a better understanding of Newton's second law of motion. Okay, that sounds good, but how do you measure that? How do you know that students have gained a better understanding? What does this mean, understanding? how do you measure that? So in order for you to have a good, effective learning outcome, it needs to be smart. It needs to be especially measurable. So something like students will be able to apply Newton's second law to one or more problems that are given on an examination. Or students will, more simply, students will be able to apply Newton's second law to relevant problems. So that we're talking about how and refining what the students are going to actually do. And then once you know what the expectation is, then we can talk about how to assess it. But making an outcome that is measurable is important. Now, before we can go into actually writing a learning outcome, we need to think about the different levels of what students might be expected to do, the different levels of thinking. So how many of you are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy? Okay, a few? And then this comes in different forms. So sometimes the words get changed, and I'm sure that they're different in Thai than in English. But the idea is still the same, that the most basic, simplest expectation for students is declarative knowledge or just memorizing, without necessarily understanding what the idea is. So, what are the colors of the rainbow? Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple. What does this mean? I don't know, but I have it memorized. And you can think of other examples. What are the letters of the alphabet? I know what these are, I don't necessarily know how to use them. So that's the foundation understanding though. But we have to start somewhere. That's a good starting point. Then comprehension. Once you have an idea about what the words or symbols, what you know what they are, what they represent, then the next level is understanding how they get used, what they really mean. So this is more comprehension, understanding. Maybe students can write a definition or an operational definition for a word or idea, and so that would be the comprehension level. And in science, we focus a lot of our attention on application. So once a certain idea or principle is known and understood, can you apply it to solving a problem? This is what we do all the time in physics, and certainly in math and chemistry. Biology would be a lot of application of that idea or principle to problem solving. The top three levels are, these are the highest levels of thinking, and this is what we typically call critical thinking. So this is kind of the foundation, and then the analysis, synthesis, evaluation, and creative ability is in the critical thinking. The problem is that a lot of our education, at least in the United States, at the elementary school level, just focuses on these lowest couple of levels. Can students memorize something and repeat it back? What's the definition for, I don't know, what are the days of the week, or what year did some event happen? I don't really know and understand much about the details, but I have at least memorized this piece of information. But it's only so useful. Can you actually put those pieces together and come up with a creative way of solving a problem or a puzzle, to bring new ideas and to synthesize those ideas together? So we often don't give students the opportunity to do this in the way that we should. In the sciences, we rarely ask students to evaluate You know, is one solution better than another solution? That's an important skill. I mean, we as educators think that that's really important, to be able to look at two solutions and be able to say, this solution is more elegant and describes the problem and comes up with an answer better than another solution. And if we could get students to do that, we would feel like that was a real success. But a lot of times we limit and focus on the lower levels. So my challenge to you is to think of some learning outcomes that focus on each of these levels, because all are important. And when we write examinations, we usually try to have a variety of difficulty of problems, so that there's some simple questions and then some that are more complex. But we try to hit all levels of this thinking, so that we're not focused too much on just one level. But because these top levels require the bottom levels, we may have fewer questions that are at this level that incorporate some of this lower level of understanding. So if you have to choose, my recommendation is that you choose questions and learning outcomes at the higher level, because that incorporates the lower levels as well. So again, how many of you are familiar with this idea? Kind of different levels of thinking. Maybe you weren't familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, but thinking about these different levels. I see quite a few of you raising your head. Okay. So when we write learning outcomes, it's important to think about some of the action verbs that would be used for each of these levels. So I gave you some examples here. What would be some action verbs that would be used for the lowest level? What did you say? Understand? I'd say understand would be at the second level, at the comprehension. Remember would be the lowest level, yes.
Identify.
What was that?
Identify.
Identify, good. And you might want to be making some lists. I can add these here in a minute. So identify would be one.
Select.
List?
Yes, select.
Yes. Yes, so just provide a list of things that were memorized. Yeah, I think those are the ones that I had to recall. The list, I think, is probably better there. Okay, so then comprehension. I already said understand. Although understand is again a bit general. It's a little bit hard to know whether a student has or has not really understood something. So how would you know if a student has understood something, at least if they have written it out? Explain. Yep. So explain is one that we use a lot on our exams. Explain this principle of angular momentum. Another one might be describe. Describe. What are some others? Compare. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, when students have to compare two different ideas, they really have to understand each of those, because you can't compare without having some understanding. So good. Compare or contrast. What's similar? What's different? Venn diagrams can be helpful for that too. So showing overlaps. What's similar? What's different? If I say Venn diagram, you know what I'm talking about? So like circles of what's in this set, and what overlaps. Good. Along with that, classify would be another one. Summarize. Explain in your own words, summarize. Infer, compare, we said. Can you think of any others?
Arrange.
Arrange, oh, that's good. Write that down. I didn't have that one. I was looking forward to learning from you. Good. Okay, what about application? Yeah, so apply this principle to this problem. So you can certainly use that as a verb. What else?
Calculate. Calculate. Yes. Calculate.
Calculate. Okay, yes, yes. I did have that one. Yes. Another one might be execute or implement, classify or construct. What about analysis? How do you go about analyzing something? Solve? Yeah. Yeah, some of these overlap a little bit, so whether you were calculating or solving a problem, those can be similar. But certainly, calculating or solving is different than memorizing. And so the idea is that there are different levels, and if there's some overlap, that's okay. Some others I had were differentiate, organize, attribute, compare, similar to what we had before, or outline. And what about evaluate? I just said compare. I would say that compare could also fit in evaluate. When you were comparing two different things and trying to decide which one is better, that's an evaluation process. Can you think of some action verbs for evaluate?
Can it be suggest? Suggest? Can it be suggest? Suggest?
Success?
No. Recommend. Recommend.
Recommend, yes. I realized that some versions of Bloom's taxonomy have the top levels reversed, and so I don't think the order matters that much. It's again just more important that we understand that there are different levels, and if the order is reversed a bit, that's okay. So evaluation and synthesis. Synthesis is sometimes goes with creation or creating. So if you are creating something new, then you basically have to understand all of what it entails and the fundamentals below. So on that evaluation, you could have check, critique, assess, conclude. And for the synthesis or the creation, it could be generate, plan, produce, or compose. If you're making a work of art or composing music, you certainly have to know about the fundamentals of what that discipline entails before you create something like that. So with some of those words, I encourage you, and it's easier for you to come up with something in Thai rather than English, that's fine. But this is mostly for your own benefit. I'd like for you to practice making at least 3 learning objectives on one certain topic, but not all the same level of thinking. So I'd like for you to come up with 2 learning objectives from the top levels, and then maybe 1 from lower. So think about some topic that is relevant to your discipline, some idea that you think should be assessed, and then come up with 3 learning outcomes using these ideas, but different levels. And then identify which level you're thinking about. Another way of doing this is to look at an exam that you or somebody else has created and identify the levels, the type of question on that exam, to do a check to see, are we asking all the same level questions, or is there a variety, and are we assessing at least some of the higher levels of thinking? So I'm asking you to do the more difficult part of coming up with your own learning objectives. But if you happen to have at your disposal some exam that maybe you've created recently, you can go back and try to identify what levels of thinking you actually came up with on that exam. So this is the process that I go through when I make an exam, try to make sure that there's a variety of different learning outcomes on each of those exams. So I'll give you a few minutes to do this individually, and then you can share with your neighbor and see if you agree with the type of outcome and the level of expectation for the students. We did a couple of the learning outcomes, and then if you have not identified which level of thinking, see if your neighbor can identify what level of thinking that learning outcome applies, and see if you agree that these are different levels of Bloom's taxonomy, different levels of thinking. And I'm not going to collect these either, so these are just for your own benefit. So just share and compare on those levels of thinking. Write learning outcomes as part of your curriculum development, that comes kind of naturally. I actually struggle with this myself. Sometimes we will make our exams or come up with a curriculum and have in our mind what we want students to do, but we don't always write it out as specific learning outcomes. In the new curriculum that we developed at UNC over the past 5 years, we tried to write the learning outcomes as we developed the curriculum, but sometimes we wrote the curriculum and then reflected on the learning outcomes afterwards. So it's not the way things are supposed to be done. You're supposed to start with one line, with what you want students to actually accomplish, and then make a curriculum that follows from that. So almost start with the exam first, and thinking about what those questions are and the levels of thinking, and then develop a curriculum that matches that. But sometimes we get it backwards, and that's okay too. Another important issue that came up on some of the cards that you submitted, reliability versus validity. So when we're assessing learning outcomes, it's important to keep in mind these 2 important measures of assessment, reliability and validity. This is especially true for examinations. So if we have examination questions, we would like to make sure that that exam is both reliable and valid. Do you understand the difference between reliable and valid? Mostly? See some puzzled looks there? So let's talk just a little bit about this. I saw a couple people nodding their head on this. Somebody like to explain the difference between reliability and validity. One is easier to measure than the other. What about reliability? How would you define reliability? we're working up Bloom's taxonomy. So now you know the terms. What do they mean? What's the comprehension? What do these terms mean? Reliability and validity. You have some sort of an assessment, like an exam. How do you know it's reliable, and how do you know it's valid? I think reliability is maybe easier to define, to measure. Go with teachers. You should know this.
Usually I use content validity. Suppose when we ask about the question is correct or not, the content correct. So if it's correct, the content is correct, it means we have validity.
Good.
Reliability.
So, I'm not really sure because these two words is always mixed up. So the reliability, that means when we just access many times, it's got the same result.
Good. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had a graphic here, but maybe I'll just draw this on the board.
Easy.
Okay, maybe it's a little bit difficult to see my graphic here. I'll see if I can pull up another one. Maybe it's a little bit more clear. But reliability and validity, as described, are basically whether we're on target for being correct. Are we measuring what we want to measure? If we're measuring what we intend to measure, then that's validity, that's being valid. So we have a target, and on average, we're hitting close to the bullseye, close to the center, then on average, that is accurate. And this target here, if the shots or points are both precise or reliable and accurate, whereas over here, we're getting good consistency, good reliability, but we're not on target. We need to recalibrate, readjust to get those shots on the target, on the bullseye. So there are different ways of measuring the reliability and validity. The reliability can be measured with statistics. And so you can use different measures like a correlation coefficient or KR20, Kuder-Richardson 20, or some other measures that you might use for reliability, Krumbach alpha. So statistics can be used to measure if the same test were given under similar conditions to the same students over and over, would you get the same results? How consistent is student performance on this particular test or question? However, validity is more difficult to measure. How do you go about assessing whether a test is valid or not? How do you know if it's on target? This is not so easy to answer. I'm asking advice from you. I'll give you my answer, but I don't know that there is a good way of measuring validity. What methods would you use to ensure that learning outcomes or exam questions are valid?
So if in the calculation, in the part of calculation, it's easy for this make the validity. We just ask them that to calculate or execute that those kind of the theory in the calculation that easy way. So, but for other, I'm not really sure that how to access to be the real, the accurate that the validity is so quite hard to do that.
Yeah, I agree that it's difficult. This goes back to that SMART acronym. In fact, I think you were the one who asked about the R, relevant. Is the learning outcome, is the exam question appropriate for this context, for this group of students, for this time and place? Is it appropriate? Is it relevant? And the best way to know that is you as the instructor or other instructors who would be familiar with the students and the curriculum. So basically, experts. So if you want to make a test that is both reliable and valid, getting it verified or validated by other instructors, other experts, is probably the best way of checking to make sure that you're on target, that it's relevant. So one method that we've used, and this has been a really big shift for us in terms of how we teach our introductory physics courses, is that these courses are now taught as a team. And in the past, we had one instructor for one class, and that instructor would make his or her own exams and grade those exams maybe with the help of a TA, but it was his class, his course, his grading, or hers, and there was some communication with other instructors, but not very much. And now, when we make an exam, we come up with the questions as a team, and we revise those over about a 2 or 3 week period to make sure that these questions are appropriate, relevant. We still don't know about the reliability. We hope that we've done a good job, but at least in terms of thinking about whether they are appropriate and relevant, whether they're on target, we've got some checks and balances to make sure that those questions are as appropriate as they can be. And we often catch mistakes that we make because we're humans. And so it's sometimes helpful to make sure that the wording is correct, that it doesn't get misinterpreted. Sometimes you can use statistics to ensure that a test question is appropriate. When I look at the statistics for a test that I've given, if I see a low correlation coefficient or a negative correlation coefficient, I have to really think about, why? Why did that question not work as well as I expected? Is it possible that students misunderstood the question? Maybe I didn't do a very good job of wording the question in a way that all students would understand. In which case, it's not really measuring what I wanted it to measure. I thought that I was addressing a concept that was appropriate, but if students misunderstood the context or they thought about it from a different perspective that was not intended, then it's not hitting the target. So sometimes you can use statistics to help guide you in knowing whether the question is relevant, whether it was valid, but often you need to get input from other experts to figure out whether that is true or correct or valid. Anybody have any questions about that? These are two really important concepts in terms of assessment, validity versus reliability.
Would you please clarify reliability?
Reliability?
Please.
Yeah, so reliability again is consistency. So if you're getting the same result time and time again, repeated, then it's reliable. So as an example, if you have a maybe if you were going to the doctor and getting your blood pressure, if you get the same reading, say 3 or 4 times in a row, then that would be reliable. But it could still be not accurate, or it still could be invalid, because maybe there's some other environmental condition that has caused your blood pressure to be unusually high or low. So maybe you were running to the doctor and you were excited, and so the blood pressure is unusually high. So maybe you're getting the same high reading, but it's not really a true measure of your normal blood pressure. Does that make sense? And you could think of other examples for like your weight or something else. So it's possible that a measure could be consistent, could be reliable, but not calibrated correctly. So you can have different shifts or errors due to environmental factors, or maybe the device that is used for measuring is miscalibrated in terms of assessment. Maybe your rubric is off a little bit. Maybe the grader was not properly trained. Sometimes when we have a call it a grading party for our exams, sometimes one grader is much stricter than others and is grading very low. And we have to maybe recalibrate and make sure that the students are getting the credit that they deserve for answers that are not correct, but are fairly reasonable. And so maybe we have to shift those scores up a little bit. Or maybe the grader is being too easy and is giving marks that are too high, and we need to pull those down a little bit. So kind of recalibrating and shifting that target for points, and to make sure that the scores are matched with the expectations.
Can I say that the validity will be on the teacher's part?
Yes.
And reliability is on the students. Can we assume that way?
Somewhat. The reliability depends on both the instructor
Depends on
and the students, yes. But you're right, the validity, the onus is on the teacher. Yeah, if the students can answer as well as they possibly can, and if it's a bad question because the teacher didn't do a very good job of writing a question that the students could understand, that's the teacher's fault. Yeah. Unfortunately, that's how it is. Yeah. It's hard for us to admit that sometimes. So, no, it's a good question. I really like that question. You really should have understood that. If the students weren't well prepared, or if the entire class does poorly on that question, sometimes it requires us to think about, what did I do wrong? Maybe I didn't prepare the students to answer that question. Or maybe the question was poorly written so that it got misinterpreted. This happens. We're humans. We're not perfect. We can't make perfect questions all the time. We at least, when we make exams, we try to have a target value. We try to get like an average of 70% with a reasonable spread. And I'd like to see at least a few students that score close to perfect. So if I don't see any A's, any students that have received A's on an exam, then I failed. Then I've made a test that was maybe too difficult or had questions that were not appropriate.
So the Mida, you just said that for the one horse, the Mida is supposed to have all the grade. You said A, B plus, B or C plus, something like that, or?
Not necessarily. I mean, I would love to have a class where everyone understood the material well enough at the A level. I usually teach classes with 200 or 300 students, and so there's usually a very wide distribution of scores. If it's a small class though, if you only have 10 students, and especially if they're master's or PhD students, it's quite possible that they are all operating at the highest level and doing well, and you're not going to see much of a distribution of scores. But if you have a large number of students, then there's usually a wide range of abilities. So as much as I would like to see students all do very well because I've done a great job of teaching, and they've done a lot of hard work, it doesn't work out that way. There's usually a wide range of abilities of students coming in, and there's usually a pretty wide distribution. In the classes I teach, our exams, we typically have scores that range from 100% down to 20 or 30%, with an average of around 70% and a standard deviation of about 15%. So that's a typical distribution for our introductory physics exams. I suspect that many of your courses are similar. What questions, comments do you have at this point?
How to use correlation coefficient to shape reliability?
Yeah, good question. So the question was, how do you use a correlation coefficient to check reliability? How many of you are familiar with the correlation coefficient, first of all? Does that sound familiar? This goes by different terms, sometimes called R or R squared, or Pearson correlation coefficient. It's basically students who perform well on that one question perform well on the exam as a whole. And so you'd like to have a high correlation coefficient on each individual exam question so that the best students are doing well on that question. If you get a low correlation coefficient or a negative correlation coefficient, it means that maybe the better students actually didn't do well on that question, and maybe some of the lower end students somehow got the question right, but there isn't a good match between the student ability overall in the class and performance on that one question. So I like to see correlation coefficients of around 0.5 to 0.7. I rarely see correlation coefficients as high as 0.8 or 0.9 on exams. Typically, I see correlation coefficients for individual questions of around 0.3 or 0.4. And so those are moderate, they're okay. But I get worried when the correlation coefficient is down around 0.1 or 0.2. And if it's negative, it's usually a bad question. Something has gone wrong there. Either the question was misunderstood, poorly written, or just maybe students were not well prepared. Maybe it was too difficult, or sometimes it's too easy. Correlation coefficient can be low if the question is too easy or too difficult. But sometimes it's okay to have some easy questions on an exam, and so I don't get too worried if the performance question is like 90%, so that nearly everyone got that question right, but then the correlation coefficient is 0.1, I'm okay with that. So sometimes thinking about the correlation coefficient in addition to the difficulty level is a good combination. So I actually calculate another statistic that I call the quality factor, which is the reliability coefficient divided by the difficulty level, so that if a question has a good reliability coefficient of something like 0.5 or 0.6, and yet it was fairly challenging, maybe only half the class got it right, then I feel like that's a win. It helps to separate those who really understood the material from those who did not. But again, it's nice to have a variety of difficulty questions so that it's not all too easy or too difficult. Did that answer your question?
Correlation that you mentioned is the correlation between the level of student and the level of occupation. I mean the different ratio of the participation and the students
Yeah, sorry, I should have explained. The correlation coefficient that I'm talking about is student performance on, as a class, on one question compared with overall in the exam. So it wouldn't be based on ranking of the student ability. So no, so I usually use an Excel spreadsheet for calculating this, and just use the correlation between performance on an individual basis for that one question compared with the total score. So just taking the correlation between those two columns.
How about using split half? Like take all the student scores, you know, and give the running number like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 until the end, and there is you know, odd and even and correlate. Can we do that?
I don't know. I suppose you can. I have not done that, but that would be another way of splitting them. Or you could also use quartiles can be used for making those comparisons too. But I typically don't do that.
Or test and retest, different, and then correlate.
Right.
Those two.
Yeah, maybe you have some experience with that you could share with everyone else. I don't know.
Because อาจารย์เนี่ยนะคนนี้เก่งให้เขาช่วยได้ในการหา correlation ของแต่ละวิชาของอาจารย์เขาเรียนมาทางด้านนี้เขาสอนที่วิชาวัดผลประเมินผลนะ Yes he can help
Please. Feel free to share.
ก็เอาให้คุณเขาครูพูดเกินไปนะก็คือหมายถึงทำงานที่นี่ใช่ไหมคะอาจารย์ก็ส่งให้แล้วให้ช่วยอธิบายด้วยว่าวิชาของอาจารย์เป็นยังไงเพราะเขาเรียนมาทางด้านนี้สอนวิชานี้ด้วยมันมีหลักการหลายวิธีอาจารย์ก็ลองดูถ้ามันออกมาใกล้ๆกันก็เรียนหลายนะเนี่ยภาษาไทยของเป็น Yes please thank you อาจารย์ไม่ได้นะมีคนช่วยใช่แล้วอดีตนะอดีตได้เลยอาจารย์สบายได้สบายดีให้อาจารย์ก็แชร์ว่า Yes I will อย่างนี้ก็
พอดีเคยสอนครับแต่ว่าไม่ได้สอนมานานมากแล้วเผื่อจะพูดเรื่องพวกนี้ก็พอได้แต่ว่าถ้าได้มีการทบทวนก่อนก็จะพูดได้ดีกว่างั้นก็ตอนนี้อาจารย์เขาคงไม่ต้องการให้มาพูดนะคะครูเดานะคะแต่อาจารย์บอกว่าช่วยดูหน่อยซิว่า correlation วิชาชั้นเนี่ยมีเรียลไลน์ไหมอะไรเงี้ยนะตามที่อาจารย์เขาว่าดีไหมคะอย่างเงี้ยเราไม่ต้องทำถ้าอยากรู้จริงๆก็ค่อยว่ากันทีให้คุณก็ทำว่าเรียลไลน์เท่าไหร่ so you accept 1.5 up is good reliability ลองดูว่าค่า correlation เราได้เท่าไหร่แล้วมีหลายรูปแบบนะอาจารย์โอเคนะคะสบายเลยนะแต่รับรองของอาจารย์ไม่มีทางต่ำกว่า5หรอกค่ะก็ไปตอบใน AUNQA ได้ว่าอาจารย์สอน learning outcomes ของอาจารย์เนี่ย
นะฮะข้อสอบของอาจารย์ยัง reliability validity ด้วย Can we say that if the reliability is very high, suppose, then the validity is good anyway?
That's a good question. If a question is reliable, is it something that we can also say is valid? Not necessarily. So again, the validity depends on the expert opinion and that relevancy. So reliability alone is not enough to consider success. You want to make sure that you have both. We're on target.
But validity map might be use the word precise and accurate a lot, and can we map validity and reliability to this word? That's
right.
Exactly the same.
Yeah. So reliability goes with precision. So if we have some sort of a measurement that is precise, then it would also be reliable. So precision and reliability can be used interchangeably, and accuracy and validity would go together. If we have a result that is accurate, it is valid. Yeah, but you don't want to switch and confuse accuracy and precision, and reliability and validity are different. And just because we have a result that is valid or accurate doesn't necessarily mean that it would be precise or reliable. It could still be getting, like you can be on target one try and then you got lucky. If you were to repeat that measure, maybe you would not be as lucky the next time. So for example, if a student gets an answer correct, is it because they really understood or because they got lucky? If there's multiple choice, maybe they guessed correctly. Or maybe they looked to the side and they copied off of their neighbor. So how do we know that the student really understands that idea? So it's only by a repeated measure that we can be more confident that the truth is known and that the student really understands this idea and could come up with the same kind of result over and over. And different times. So the other challenge, as we know, is that students may understand something now, but will they remember and understand 6 months from now or a year from now? We often are not assessing students longitudinally over long periods of time. And so what really matters is whether they can apply this knowledge and information in their jobs 5 years from now or 10 years from now. Will they retain and understand this information in a way that is meaningful long term? Those are harder for us to assess in a class that we're teaching for just half a year. Yes?
You talk about the correlation between the item and the total score for the reliability. So how can we check the reliability on what we measure for example, soft skills, leadership, which we usually use the rubrics for assessment. So how can we check the reliability?
Yeah, that's more difficult because the soft skills also have more variability. And so the reliability is wider. It's not as precise, not as well defined. So there's more scatter in the data points. Anytime we're dealing with human subjects, they tend to not be very consistent. And so in education research, I should have explained a little bit too. So my background is in physics, but specifically my degree is in physics education research. So in learning how students learn, how we teach, and how we do a better job of matching those. And unfortunately, students are not as easy to measure as material things. yeah, the subatomic particles often are more reliable than students, more predictable. And so those soft skills are difficult to measure because there's so much variability. And so especially if you want to see, is a student improving over time, the signal to noise ratio can be very difficult to discern to get a measurable difference. But using rubrics is a good way to start, and over time you may see some sort of hopefully an upward trend of improvement on some measure of leadership or communication. So I guess my recommendation would be to use rubrics, but not to expect miracles. You can only get so much useful information on the soft skills because there is so much variability. But maybe some of you have some suggestions on how to measure those soft skills in a more meaningful way. I think rubrics are probably the best way that I know. Does anyone have any other suggestions? When you're making these learning outcomes and like exam questions, there are also many threats to validity. So I know in at least one education course that I took, we studied about many different threats to validity. Maybe you can think of some that would affect student performance that may or may not be intentional. Can you think about some different threats to validity? So you have what maybe should be a good question, but what would maybe influence student performance on that question that would be important to think about when you were looking at assessment? What are some different factors that influence student performance that maybe you should be thinking about, but sometimes we forget? I'll give some examples. Maybe there are environmental factors. Maybe the student was sick that day, or tired, or maybe there was a family emergency, a death in the family. Does the student understand this topic? Maybe, but not today. So that would be one example of a threat to validity that could influence student performance on a certain exam question that was certainly not intentional, not necessarily the fault of the instructor or the student, but there are these other factors to consider. Can you think of some other influences, especially when we're making comparisons between maybe like groups of students? What are some factors that you know can influence student performance, that is test scores? Yes?
I'm not very sure whether this could be a factor or not, but I remember one of the exam questions that I had, and I used it in 2 years. The first year it was, the exam was probably by the instructor, but the second year I got to the exam. And the second year I found out that some students had a question about one expression, mathematical expression that I gave in the exam. The question I was written specifically that this part was unrelated to the previous 2 problems. So they have to read that part to know that the expression to use is the one I give in that question, not the one that was in the previous 2 questions. So I think maybe one factor that could affect performance is that maybe there is a very fine writing that they have to read very carefully and follow the instructions.
Right, good. Let me start making a list of these threats. I've forgotten to include this, and I think this is important. Okay, my computer went to sleep, so. I think that the one that you were talking about here kind of relates to how does that question relate to other questions in the exam, and if students maybe are well prepared on the previous question, or if their questions are linked, it's important to be able to think about the connection between other questions on the exam. The question order can be important. What are some other factors that you can think of that affect student performance? Language, yes, good. Certainly, we have a language barrier today. I'm limited in English, and I apologize, so thank you for helping out in your native language. But also cultural context can matter too. So even if the language is clear, we sometimes have to be careful to come up with questions that are culturally appropriate. So if, for example, I ask a question about cricket, a sport that is not played and not very well known in the US, my students will be confused. If I ask about baseball, most of my students would understand the context. But maybe some students who are not from the US, maybe some international students who understand cricket but not baseball, would be confused. So we have to be careful about coming up with context in questions that is appropriate for all the learners. So I'll add that cultural context. What are some other factors to consider when you're making exam questions or thinking about the results, that a good question may be affected by different factors? So time of day is one that we look at. So if we are giving the same exam to different sections of the same course, and we want to make comparisons, we need to think about the time of day in which that exam was administered. So maybe students don't do as well in the 8 o'clock class versus the 9 o'clock class in the morning, because maybe the students are still somewhat asleep in the first class. I'm curious, what time do classes start here? 8 o'clock? 8:30?
Yeah.
Okay. Our first class starts at 8 o'clock, and students don't usually like it. So there are two different factors that we have to consider there. Maybe the time of day is an issue for students, but also as students register for these classes, like if we have an 8 o'clock class and maybe a 1 o'clock in the afternoon class, the more senior students get to register first, and so they will choose the more preferable time, the afternoon time. And the early students, like the first or second year students, don't get the first choice when they register for classes. So we get a difference in population of students in the classes depending on the time of day. So we have to look and see, based on other measures, maybe grade point average, or maybe some sort of a pre-survey that we take at the beginning of the semester to see, are these students the same level? Because maybe one group of students is better prepared, maybe more mature than the other. And so the fact that one group got an average of 70% on the exam and the other group got an average of 75% is not because they actually understood at different levels, but because they were coming in with different levels of preparation. And so maybe that should be an expected difference and should not be a surprise. If it's the reverse though, if the better prepared students do worse than expected, oh, okay, so we should pay attention to that. Maybe there are some other factors. You also mentioned something that is different. You said that you got different results when you taught the class versus another instructor.
Not different result, but there was some maybe unclear statement in the exam, for example.
Okay.
This one is called international program, but most of the students, maybe all of the students are Thai.
Okay.
When I write specifically that when you just one line, that this question is not related to the previous one. So when they do the new question, they have to use what given in that question instead of some result of the previous one.
Okay. Okay, so that maybe goes mostly to the language issue. But this instructor effect is certainly an important consideration. So maybe it's not too surprising, but we definitely see differences in performance on the same test or the same question depending on who's teaching the class. Sometimes because of the language that's used or the preparation that's given, statements that are made in class, sometimes just based on experience, or maybe that instructor didn't cover that topic and the question was really not so relevant for those students, and because the students were not well prepared. What are some other threats to validity that you can think of? Different factors that would affect student results that we need to consider. One that I just mentioned was preparation level. I'd say about half of our students take physics before they come to college. So they've had physics in high school, but not all of our students are required to do so. And so that preparation, the level of preparation that they come to our classes with definitely makes a difference, especially with math preparation. Math is the language of physics, so students who have a higher level of math understanding definitely do better in our classes, and so knowing about that level of preparation is important. Have Have you heard of the Hawthorne effect or novelty effect? So this relates maybe more to a curriculum. So if you were assessing traditional curriculum versus a new strategy, sometimes students will perform better and be more attentive to the new strategy just because it is new. And so that novelty effect can have either a positive or a negative effect. Sometimes we see a negative effect if the curriculum is not very well established or tested because it's new and you haven't worked out all of the difficulties. And so sometimes we need to allow the curriculum several attempts, maybe several semesters to get to the steady state operation. So like the first time that we implemented our new curriculum, it worked okay, but it wasn't as good as the second or third time. So that novelty effect can work either positively or negatively. 2 years, 5 years after taking a certain class. What are some other ways of evaluating the effectiveness of a curriculum or a course?
You get the percentage of the students get job.
Okay.
1 year after graduation.
Yeah. So again, yeah, that's an important measure. Just 1 year after graduation?
Usually we track them about a year.
Okay.
After that. And then we do less and less.
Okay.
We try to get to know the time where you go in the first year.
Right. Okay, so knowing whether the students are employed in a similar field or employed at all, a year, maybe 2 years or 3 years after graduating. Good. Now, our department doesn't do a very good job of tracking students that way. We should probably do a better job, so it's good to doing that. Are you familiar with concept surveys? So depending on the discipline, there are some conceptual surveys that are used for evaluating students' content knowledge about a specific discipline. So like in physics, there are about 30 different concept surveys, some that are used quite often. So there's one called the Force Concept Inventory that we use, and another one called the Conceptual Survey in Electricity and Magnetism that we use. We use these for our introductory physics classes. And they don't cover all of the topics taught in the course, but they cover some of the most essential topics. These surveys are multiple choice tests. We don't call them tests, we call them surveys because we give them to the students at the beginning of the semester and then at the end of the semester. And of course, at the beginning of the semester, they're not expected to know the answers to the questions. If they did, there wouldn't be any purpose in taking the class. But hopefully, they have learned something and performed better on that same measure at the end of the semester. And so we track student performance to see how much they learned from the beginning to the end of the semester, this pre-post survey. And these surveys are administered at many schools around the United States, around the world even. And so we can make comparisons with other schools to see how our students are doing with our curriculum compared with other curricula, and to see how students are performing in one class versus another. So we can make comparisons within our own institution and then with other institutions. And so that's probably the best measure that we have of making fair comparisons from one class to another. I think I can show you some results here. Okay, so these are some graphs that show the transition from our traditional to our reform classes. So this is for one of the surveys, the course content inventory. Students took the survey at the beginning of the semester and then again at the end of the semester. And it was the same survey that was administered over multiple semesters. So this is fall 2010, spring 2011, so on, down to fall 2012, as we made this transition from the traditional to scale-up format, this active learning engagement. So the dark blue bars indicate the learning gains, normalized gain for the traditional course, and then the light blue bars indicate the modified version of the course. So you can see there was some variability, but consistently the reform program, the students did significantly better than in the traditional. So this was our measure of convincing ourselves that, yeah, this effort was worthwhile. It took quite a bit of time and effort to come up with this new way of teaching, but it looks like students are learning more based on this conceptual survey. Now again, the survey did not cover everything that was covered in the course. It covered some of the essentials of basically Newton's laws of motion. But there were topics that experts feel like are important, therefore valid. And so if students are doing better, at least on these important areas, then we felt like, okay, we're doing something right. So this is good. I think we're on the right track, and we should keep doing this active learning approach. And we had similar results for, this was the first semester course for mechanics, and then we had another survey for our electricity and magnetism course. And again, the modified version of the course, students did significantly better on those as well. And this was over multiple semesters, different instructors. So some of those threats to validity that I talked about, different time, different place, different instructors, you get some meta-analysis that averages those effects. And so if we're seeing significant improvement over different variables, then we have some confidence that we're doing something right. So again, this is one measure, but we've used final exam scores and some other feedback. I would imagine that students give feedback on some evaluations at some point. Are there course evaluations that students give feedback?
Yes.
Is that usually at the end of the semester, or do you do mid-semester evaluations, mid-course evaluations?
Usually at the end.
Usually just at the end? Okay. We find we have official evaluations at the end of each course that are required by the university, but we find that the mid-semester evaluations are more helpful for us and for the students because it gives us an opportunity to respond to student concerns while we still have some time to do a course correction. It also gives the opportunity for students to give feedback while they feel like they could do something. So rather than just complaining about the course at the end of the course when it's too late, there's an opportunity for action to still be taken when we get that feedback in the middle of the term. It's also helpful for me because I'm responsible for supervising our graduate teaching assistants and undergraduate teaching assistants. And so if somebody is not doing a good job teaching, I can take action to address that concern rather than wait until the end of the semester. So a challenge to you maybe, if you are not doing mid-semester evaluations, maybe consider doing that informally. A very easy way to do that and give credit for students so they take it seriously or don't even have to. They can write their name on a piece of paper and make it anonymous by giving that paper to somebody else in the class, and then the other person writes their comments on it. And then you're guaranteed that the comments are not from that person whose name is on the paper. But you can just leave the name off too and just make it anonymous. You can also submit comments electronically if you do a survey using SurveyMonkey or some other online survey tool. like a Google poll. Yes.
Can I have a quick question on this? Basically, it's the traditional and scale up. They teach different groups of students, and then at the end, before and after they do the survey.
Right.
And is there any how can I say? I don't know the word, but when we treat the student differently, is there any issue on that part that is good?
Like in terms of ethics about treating the students differently? Yeah, so in fact I made that argument that it's a little bit like in the medical profession, if you were doing some analysis on a drug and you give one group the medication and the other group you give sugar pill placebo, if the treatment group is doing much better, at some point you have to say, wait, it's not right to keep giving, to withholding the medication from the placebo group. We need to stop the study and give treatment to everyone. I have the same opinion that if we know that this other method, the new method, works better, it's almost unethical to continue teaching in a way that we know is not as effective. So I made the argument to our department that we really need to do this for everyone. So this was two groups of students. Some were in the treatment group, some were in the traditional group, and now they're all in the treatment group. So we decided, okay, everyone gets the new and improved active learning.
A little bit more on this is two groups when we first start, they have different, not just only teaching methods, but exam as well, right? Or the exam has to be the same?
Same exam.
Same exam.
Yeah, they were given the
concept survey, something extra, right?
Both groups took the same concept survey as well, but no credit for this.
Okay, but the exam, the group has to be the same.
That's right. That's right. Although when we first started doing this, some of the exams were different. So towards the end of the evaluation, we were getting to common exams, but I don't have comparisons because of that reason, because some of the exams were different. But this concept survey was the same for all students.
And it's like, since the students know that there's no point or no score or anything from the concept of that, and sometimes they're just doing by just only guessing or not thinking at all. Do you have any kind of
Yeah, that's a challenge. So there's definitely an effect if you give this kind of concept survey for credit versus no credit. Like if you make it part of the final exam, students will do better. They'll take it more seriously. So we have to screen for students that don't take it seriously. So we have to go through and look to see if students answered A for everything, basically didn't think about the results, or if there's a methodology, if they answer in a zigzag pattern or something that looks like they were not treating it seriously. And so those paired results that are not matched well get excluded from the analysis. So you have to be a little bit careful on how we do those comparisons and that analysis, whether they are screened or not.
Okay. One more question
Sure.
about this. Do you have a committee to do the conceptual survey, or how do you come up with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that survey was created by a research group about 30 years ago now. So they put a lot of time and effort into making the survey, and it took several years. So it's not something that was developed very quickly. And so we have used that survey along with thousands of other students and classes. And so that's not something that we made. It was a survey that was developed by another research group. Yeah, so usually these surveys are a PhD students' project. They spend a couple of years with a research group to develop the survey.
Just to share with that, at the moment we try to implement new parameters separate the student into group, and we have hard time to compare those, and then to try talk to the professors or lecturer in order to use some common core, for example, the final exam, or something that they how can I say, difficult to convince them to join. I don't know what to say, but at least the problem at the moment.
Right. That is a challenge.
Question.
Yes.
I think this question is very good. So the nature of the conceptual survey is actually guiding the way we teach.
It can.
Because it's like a benchmarking test, and then any test that the student got that closer to that nature, they will perform better.
Yeah, this is something that we've struggled with for our class that we teach for the life science majors. So maybe you're familiar with the MCAT, the medical, what does MCAT stand for? I don't remember now. It's the test that is taken by all students who want to go to medical school in the U.S. And so it's a big test that is feared by many. But student performance on that test is a really important factor as to whether they get accepted to medical school or not. So one thing that we struggle with is whether we should teach to that test, even though that test covers biology, chemistry, physics, and some mathematics, but basically all the sciences that students need for medical school. And so the physics portion, we know what concepts and topics are on the MCAT, and we decided that we would not teach to that test and use that as a measure. We felt like that was maybe not the most authentic, that we would choose what we thought was most important and not use that as a kind of a benchmark. But we could, and we could look at that. But you're right, choosing what you use as a measurement tool, benchmark, again goes to this issue of validity. If we're teaching to the test and we think that it's a valid measure, then maybe that's good. If the test is not well aligned with the curriculum, then that's not a good choice. And so whenever you're deciding about what assessment tool, if you make your own, fine, but if you are borrowing somebody else's assessment tool, you want to make sure that it really is aligned with the learning objectives for that curriculum or that program. If not, then there's a mismatch, and you might be teaching to the wrong thing, and especially over time, if we're trying to raise test scores and the assessment is not well aligned with the curriculum, then the curriculum is going to steer in the wrong direction, and that's not necessarily desirable. This is a big issue at the lower levels in like in middle school and high school in the United States. I don't know if you've heard of end of grade exams and No Child Left Behind. But there's a lot of emphasis in the past 20 years now on teaching to these tests and getting students prepared for tests that some people feel are not well aligned with what students should be doing. And so that is a danger. When you develop a measurement tool, there's the tendency to teach to that medical tool or teach to that test. And if the test is on target, that's good. If the test is not on target and not well aligned with the curriculum, then that's not in everyone's best interest. Okay, so again, you can look at this program evaluation from multiple perspectives. Final exams, as we mentioned, these concept surveys, student feedback. We sometimes conduct interviews or focus groups with students, especially when we're trying out a new curriculum or a new activity, trying to get feedback from students on what worked well, what didn't work well, what they understood, what was confusing. We do the same sometimes with our instructors, getting feedback from them about what's working well, what's not, what their challenges are. Some of our biggest challenges in developing a new curriculum have been actually on the faculty side, on the expectations for the teaching requirements and the expectations to go with that in terms of the workload. So I think maybe I mentioned to a couple of you that our new format for teaching requires more time in the classroom. And so we've shifted from lecture to more of this active learning environment. So students are still going to class for 6 hours per week, but the faculty members are more involved with the students during that time. And so there's more, they basically have to work more hours, and not everyone appreciates that. So there's been a challenge of, for the faculty who have been assigned to teach these courses, that they teach maybe for 2 semesters and then get a semester off as kind of a break from the more intense teaching. So that's been a compromise that we have arranged in addition to this team teaching approach. Can you think of any other ways of evaluating the program? Again, this is a kind of learning assessment in the broadest sense. You look at programming rather than just student performance for a shorter period of time. Okay, maybe I'll pause there. Anybody have any questions or comments?
Sure. How university do you how to survey from the stakeholder, for example, for those who employ our students, and what they think about our students, how they perform. So we factor that in when we do the program evaluation or change the curriculum or something like that.
Good. Yeah, that's something that we don't have. So we sometimes are guessing. We think that our students should have these skills and abilities when they graduate, so they will be able to get good jobs. But if you have a close connection with the stakeholder and can get feedback about what the students need to master into the curriculum, that's an excellent way to evaluate student performance and then also the program. We do that on a general sense for our general education requirements for the university. We know from broad-based surveys from employers nationwide what employers are looking for. And it's usually about the same top 10 list. Good communication skills, both speaking and writing, good teamwork skills, reliability, good leadership skills. So these things, again, kind of the soft skills that we were talking about seem to be really important for all kinds of jobs. And so we want students to have those skills as part of all of our classes across the curriculum. But again, some of those are difficult to measure. All right, let me switch a little bit to a specific type of assessment, one that is something that I've spent a lot of time developing and I think may be beneficial for some of you, and that is the performance assessment. So we've been talking a little bit about exams and soft skills, and this is something that kind of bridges between those. So in our laboratory portion of the course, we want students to learn skills that they gain from the laboratory experience, from their hands-on activities. And this is different than being able to solve a problem on pencil and paper that you would expect in a physics, a math, a chemistry class. Can students actually do an activity and do it correctly and get good results? And so it's more of a performance measure. So if you'll allow me a little bit of time to share with you about my experience on that, I'll switch to that one. So this is a talk that I gave a couple years ago at the AAPTV, American Association of Physics Teachers. And so some of this will be more relevant than others, and I'll try to pick out some of the most relevant pieces. So again, this is about performance in laboratory. Gave this lab exam to our introductory physics students in 2 different course sequences. And we had labs. Students attended labs for 2 hours per week in the traditional format. And the lab exam accounted for 20% of their total lab score, which is 25% or a quarter of their course grade. And so this amounted to essentially 2 of their lab reports that they submitted throughout the course. So typically we're doing 9 labs for the course, and this was equivalent to 2 of those lab reports. I'm curious, those of you who teach science classes, I assume that the students submit lab reports for at least some of that work. We've actually pulled away from that. Now our students in one course sequence don't submit any lab reports. They just do group worksheets, and so they're submitting answers as a group, again 3 students. And then in the other course sequence, they submit just 1 lab report per semester. So they're not getting nearly as much experience writing lab reports in our course, but they are still getting experience in chemistry. And so we decided in conjunction with the chemistry department that this was okay. I'm still a little bit sad about that though. I think that there's still some value in getting students repeated practice in writing lab reports. Anyhow, students were given a sample lab exam to practice, so they knew what was expected of them. And I'll show you a little bit what some of those questions look like. So again, as we made this transition, the 1 course sequence for the life science majors no longer has the lab exam component, but the sequence for the physical science majors still has that piece. But rather than having 1 single lab exam that took about 2 hours, we broke it up into 3 pieces that was administered along with each of the midterm exams. So for each of these 3 midterm exams, the students have about a half-hour lab exam. That accounts for usually 25% of that midterm exam. And then they have a written portion that they do in the lecture, and they get 1 grade for that exam, putting those pieces together. So you might ask, why have a lab exam? So again, it's to measure some of these skills that are not captured by the lecture exam, some of these process or performance skills. We also noticed that as students work together in groups, naturally some students are more leaders and some are more followers. And you probably have seen students working in groups of 2 or 3, and maybe 1 student is doing most of the work and another one is content to just take notes and not actually put their hands on the equipment. But we really wanted students to learn all of the laboratory skills. And so we wanted a way to hold each individual student accountable for learning some of these basic skills. can everyone know how to use a digital balance, a vernier caliper, a meter stick, whatever? Can they use the equipment? Can they report numbers appropriately? Or are they relying on their lab partners, on their fellow students to do the work for them? We also wanted to see if our TAs were mastering some of this material, if they were teaching appropriately, if our curriculum was doing a good job, and if there are any deficiencies there that we needed to address. We also wanted a way to evaluate the proficiency of students who were coming in from like a high school program where maybe they had already mastered most of these skills and they didn't need to take our laboratory course. We were also getting some complaints from some of our faculty that the lab scores were all about the same and there wasn't much dispersion in the scores, and we needed some way to discriminate in a positive way the high-end students from the lower-end students, to distinguish the A students from like the C students. So some of the faculty were complaining that the lab scores were just adding a universal shift to the overall scores, and they wanted to see some width to the distribution. So this lab exam was able to accomplish that. So these were the learning objectives. Notice some of the action words that similar to what we talked about earlier in terms of coming up with learning objectives. Identify, apply, determine. I'll let you read those. Basically, we wanted to test students on the activities they were doing already in the lab, so not anything new, just could they do the activities that were expected of them that maybe they had already done, hopefully on their own. Could they do those individually rather than just as a group? So again, this was an individual exam. Students worked independently. It's a little bit of a challenge because they were still taking this exam in a laboratory setting, sort of like a room like this, where they could see each other's work. So we had to be a little bit careful about students getting ideas from each other or copying from each other. So I'll talk a little bit about that. They were allowed to use their lab books and notes, and so they could use other resources. They just couldn't explicitly talk with other students or the instructor. This was administered during a 2-hour period, and then later broken up into half-hour segments. Again, there was a sample lab exam and equipment for students to be able to practice, so that this was not a surprise. We wanted students to master these skills. And these lab exams stayed pretty consistent from semester to semester. Sometimes the questions would change a little bit, but the format was very consistent from one term to another. But we did treat it like a final exam. The students were not allowed to keep their exam papers because we didn't want them copying answers from one semester to another. So these are some of the questions from the first semester course. So you get a sense of the activities that the students were expected to do. Here are some questions from the second semester course. So again, our introductory physics courses are split up over a 1-year sequence. First semester, mechanics, the second semester, electricity and magnitude. So basically we aim for about 1 question per week of the course. And we got a detailed grading rubric for assessing student performance on these questions. Used Excel for scoring that, and gave partial credit for answers based on the accuracy of the values. So typically, students would get full credit if they took a measurement and got within 2 standard uncertainties of that the most accurate measurement. And then they would get partial credit, maybe 50% credit if they were within 5 standard uncertainties, and then maybe 1 or 2 points for some smaller partial credit if they were within a broader range. So basically, students were being rewarded for getting closer to a good accurate value, and then getting partial credit closer or further away that they got from that. One nice thing about this exam was that the reliability of the scores were quite consistent. So if 2 different graders graded the same student's results, they usually got within 2%, which was better than what we were getting for like a typical lab report grade, where if you and I both graded the same lab report, we might agree within 5%, probably within 10%, but most likely not within 2%. So this turned out to be a fairly reliable measure, hopefully valid. But again, validity is one of the things you can't guarantee. This is kind of the breakdown of what we consider to be important. So most of the credit for being able to make accurate measurements with the equipment and tools and procedures that were being taught. And then some smaller credit for uncertainty and significant figures and units and labels, all of which we think are important, but maybe not as important as applying a correct procedure and getting good measurements. So this may be the most important slide, typical results. Not that great overall. The average score on these exams is around 70%. So nothing like the 85 to 90% average that students were getting on the lab reports. So many students didn't like this exam because they didn't do very well on it compared with their lab reports. It definitely measures something different than what they were being assessed on their lab reports. The lab reports is mostly about could they explain what they did in the lab, but this test was more about could they perform at a certain level? Could they actually do the measurements, use the equipment appropriately? And in many cases, the answer is no. So even with practice and knowing what's expected of them, still didn't do as well as they should have. And the reality is when we would test our TAs, the graduate students, they didn't do so well either. Did better than the students that they were teaching, but definitely not 100%. And even when I did, assess myself on taking these measurements, I wouldn't always get 100% either. I would usually get an A, but it would be somewhere like 95%. So this is a fairly difficult exam to get really good results. But that's part of the nature of science, is that we can't always make accurate measurements every single time. There are a lot of different factors to consider, and even when you know what you're doing, you have to be really careful to make really good measurements. But there are some parts that I'm kind of disappointed about. 35% on uncertainty. A lot of our students don't write down an uncertainty or don't know how to express that uncertainty well. Again, that was the topic of my dissertation research, so that was kind of the biggest challenge for many students in a section that they don't like. And we actually pulled back in our curriculum from that, and it's an important piece of our physics majors curriculum, but for life science majors, they don't do any uncertainty analysis now. We decided that it's just not that important. It's still an area of interest for me, but in the grand scheme of things, not as important as some other pieces. So the point here is that there's fluctuations across the board, but from semester to semester, not a lot of variation. You don't see an upward or downward trend over time. The exam scores are fairly consistent across the board. So it looks like students are not necessarily improving or decreasing in their performance. But we did see a shift when we went to the new format for this lecture studio curriculum. So when we shifted from the traditional format to the new lecture studio format that I showed you with the round tables, you notice that those green bars go up. So we're seeing improved performance there, and also those purple bars, not as much, the slope is not as great there, but it looks like something's going right with the curriculum. This would be over multiple semesters, multiple instructors, and so it looks like students are performing increasingly higher. Either that or maybe they're figuring out how to perform on the test from other students, but we think that that's not very likely. I'll show you why here in a second. Yeah, it's a summary of what I just said, I guess. Yeah, so this test seems to be fairly robust in, even though we're using essentially the same test over and over, it looks like students are not necessarily teaching to that test or learning from that, from the results from previous tests. And there was a concern that maybe students in later sections of the test, so this test was given over a 1-week period, and so we were concerned that maybe the students taking the test on Thursday or Friday were talking to the students on Monday or Tuesday to learn from them, hey, what's on that test, and how did you do, and what can I do to prepare? And so if that's true, we'd expect there to be an upward trend, a positive slope for the students later in the week. So these are later scores are to the right, later sections, and on the left are sections earlier in the week. But there doesn't seem to be much of an upward slope there, fairly random distribution of scores. So that fear at least was mitigated, and it does not seem to be very valid. This is some performance on individual questions, so I'll skip over that. So overall, we found like this was a fairly good measure of student performance. It's different than what students were being assessed on their midterm exams. The correlation between, I think I may have skipped over that, back us up. Okay, maybe I took that slide out, I'm sorry. The correlation in student performance with this lab exam and the lecture exam is pretty high, but the correlation between the lab exam and the lab report scores is fairly low. So that indicates to me that this is measuring something different than the lab report scores, and therefore was not redundant, so not wasted effort, but at least consistent with overall performance in the class. So that with validation from the students and the instructors that these questions were relevant and appropriate, led us to think that this is a good use of class time, although the students still did not necessarily like having to prepare for it. But it was also a useful motivational tool for getting them to spend some extra time and effort in learning some of these skills. So I'm also going to share this with you as yet another way to assess students' abilities that's different than just a typical written exam. That we don't need to be limited just to written examinations. We can also assess students' ability to perform skills, activities. One thing that we have not been doing that, again, might be of interest would be students' ability to communicate orally with each other or with an instructor, so basically an oral exam. But we don't have a way of doing that with our large classes. So if anyone has suggestions on how to do that, maybe it would be a good time to share. So any thoughts or questions about kind of a performance skills assessment?
Yes. You have 9 learning objectives, right? And you have 9 labs.
Right.
That's it. I mean, each lab for each objective or everyone?
It wasn't a one-to-one. That was more coincidence that that happened to be 9. But roughly, we aimed for approximately 1 question for each lab. But there was some overlap. So it wasn't exactly one-to-one matching.
So one lab may test many.
Yeah, there were a couple of questions that that corresponded to multiple labs, so there was some overlap. But on average, one-to-one. In these courses, you have, I guess, between 100 and 400 students per course in the labs. In the traditional labs, we had between 15 and 20 students in a lab section. Now, our studio sections typically have 40 to 50 students in a studio section. So we've scaled up the number of students in the room, but then we also have multiple instructors. So it used to be 1 graduate TA for 1 lab section, again with about 15 to 20 students in that section. And now we have typically 2 TAs, maybe 1 graduate student with 1 undergrad student as a learning assistant in a section with 40 to 50 students. So we aim for a ratio of about 1 instructor for every 20 to 25 students. What kind of, I'm seeing some interesting faces from you. What kind of instructor to student ratio do you have? At least in a laboratory setting. In the lecture, it's very different. You have maybe 1 instructor with 100 to 300 students. So a very different ratio. What were you saying for labs?
The lab class in chemistry, actually there are 36 students for 1 class. And we have the 2 teachers.
2 teachers. Okay. Are those teachers faculty, graduate students, or undergrad?
Actually, if we have enough staff, I mean, they too are instructors.
Okay.
If we just maybe some is 1 instructor and 1 TA.
Okay. And the TA is usually a graduate student or an undergraduate student?
Graduate student.
Okay. Do any of your classes have undergraduate students serving as instructors or facilitators? We call them learning assistants, to differentiate from a teaching assistant that is responsible for grading. So like our graduate students are TAs, and they do grading for the classes, but the learning assistants are there just to facilitate the learning. So these are usually students who have taken the class already, maybe just a year ago. Usually they've done well in the class. And then they're there as more of a coach or facilitator to help guide the students in the learning. Do you have any of these kind of undergraduate teaching assistants or learning assistants?
We do have in physics a little bit, but not that common.
Okay.
We only have maybe, I can say less than 10. But for TA, probably have like 30 or something.
Okay, yeah. And so we have about 40, for any one term, we have usually about 40 graduate teaching assistants and usually 10 to 20 undergraduate learning assistants. And we pay them differently, of course. But the students are getting paid instead of getting course credit. Some departments give course credit for their learning assistants rather than paying them to teach, and some just get volunteers, and we'll write a letter of recommendation to those students to help them get into graduate school or get a job or something. So there are different models for how to compensate the undergraduate students. The graduate students, I think, all get paid in stipend, although that can vary from department to department. Science is usually paid more than the humanities. Maybe it's the same is true here. Are there any other departments that use undergraduate students as instructors? Kind of coaches? This is becoming more and more common in the United States, this learning assistant model. There's a group from University of Colorado at Boulder, CU Boulder, has had this learning assistant program for about 15 or to 20 years now, and they really have been encouraging people to utilize undergraduates as learning assistants, and it's becoming more and more common, not just in lab courses, but also in lecture courses. So this think, pair, share, sometimes the learning assistants are used in the classroom when the students are talking with each other to go and interact with the groups as they're talking with each other. We do this with some of our classes, but we tend to use the undergraduates mostly in the laboratory setting. Any other questions, comments about performance exam?
I'm from a different department. In your lab, in science lab, how do you assess the performance when they are performing the test or the experiment? Because in architecture, we do design, they have the result. We cannot do 1 to 20, we have to do 1 to 10 for a whole afternoon because we need to discuss a whole process of thinking. They did not perform in front of you, but this is the student perform in front of you, right? And then you walk along, and how did you kind of point out that this is good, this is...
Yeah, it's a good question. So we wrestled with this, whether we would kind of monitor the students and watch them perform, or whether we would just grade them on their results. And we decided to do the latter. So we do not observe and watch and see if they are actually doing the procedure correctly. But in many cases, there are multiple ways to get the same result, and some procedures are better than others. So as long as the students were able to get a good result, they would write down the procedure, so we would grade them that way if they chose a good procedure, but mostly we were grading them on the result, on the finished product. And so if they were using a procedure that gave a good result and they got a good answer, then they got a good grade. And if they used a result that was not appropriate and gave them a bad result, then they got a low score. So we just graded them on the results only. Well, mostly except for the little bit of credit for the procedure that they explained. But for the most part, most of these questions, it was impossible to get a good result with a bad procedure, unless they got lucky. But they would have to do that on multiple questions, or copy from each other. And we had a few cases of that. I had to, I don't know if you have an honor system for students who might be cheating. But in one case, we had 3 students who sat next to each other and happened to get the same result. And in my view, this is highly improbable. And so I took them to the honor court, and yeah, they got in trouble with that. So that can happen too. But this seemed to be a fairly robust measure, where the better students scored higher, and the students who were relying on their lab partners throughout the semester and didn't really learn the lab skills scored well. But in some cases, it was interesting that sometimes students would do well on the lab exam and not be able to explain their results very well in lab reports, and then sometimes the reverse. So there was again, not a very strong correlation in that performance. Definitely a different skill set. just because you know what to do and can perform well doesn't mean that you can necessarily communicate that in writing, and vice versa. Sometimes you can explain bad results and do a pretty decent job in terms of your writing assessment, but you still haven't obtained good results. So you probably know people like this. There's some people who are good scientists, good in the lab, and then can't give a good presentation. Some of the worst presentations I've heard have been from Nobel laureates. Like, how? You may be a good scientist, but you can't explain this. So there are examples where there's not necessarily a strong correlation. Just because you're a good scientist doesn't mean that you can communicate well. And then there's some people who can communicate well and don't know what they're talking about. We happen to have a president in that situation, but never mind about that. Other thoughts, comments? Okay. I think we're supposed to have a break about now. Maybe now's a good time to have a little break, and then I'd like for you to be thinking about kind of a plan for your future. So I handed out some index cards again for you to do some brainstorming either on those cards or maybe in your own notes about how you will use the information that we've been talking about. Kind of what you've learned and what you might do in the future. I'll pose some questions for you to consider, that you can be thinking about that, and then most of the rest of the time we'll be thinking about kind of putting these ideas into practice and talking with each other about how best to move forward in the next steps. If you haven't already done so, I encourage you to take a few minutes to think about an action plan. Basically, how will you use what we've been talking about today in some way that will be useful for you? What action will you take? And what challenges do you anticipate as you take that action? So there are always challenges in implementing new ideas or practices. So if you have something that you would like to try, there will probably be difficulties. What difficulties do you anticipate? And then how do you plan to overcome those challenges? So just take a few minutes to think about those, and then I'll have you talk with each other on what ways would be best to address those, and maybe you can help each other overcome those challenges, and we'll share together as a group. Again, this is to benefit you. So the information that I was sharing before was hopefully beneficial for you. So I was sharing from my experiences and trying to pull from some of your examples. but this is all for you. So if you think about something that you've been meaning to do, it's been on your to-do list, yeah, I know I should work on this project, now's an opportunity for you to think about how you will actually get that done, and to utilize the colleagues here and to find a way to actually take action and get something useful done. If you want to turn in your cards to me, to share with me, fine, but this is mostly to benefit you, so you can keep your notes, or you can put answers in a notebook or your own paper or on your computer. But I will ask you to share at least with each other, and if you want to share with me,